Before the 1950s, if an American road crew hit solid mountain bedrock, they had to stop. They had to drill holes, pack them with explosives, and blow the mountain to pieces just to move forward. It was slow, expensive, and incredibly dangerous. But then, one machine changed the rules of the Earth forever. It was so heavy, it replaced dynamite. This is the story of the Caterpillar D9. It was a 70,000-pound monster equipped with a single terrifying weapon on its back, a massive forged steel ripper claw that shattered mountains. But building a tractor strong enough to tear the Earth's crust apart came with a deadly catch. When you force a tungsten claw into solid rock with 35 tons of pressure, something has to give. And if the rock did not break, the machine did. How did engineers build a weapon that defied physics? And what happened when they unleashed a beast so powerful, it terrified the men in the cab? Congress didn't just want a new road, they wanted a continent split open on a deadline. The Interstate Highway Act, Public Law 84-607, passed the House 388-19, then squeezed through the Senate 41-39. That's not a landslide, that's a government with a boot on the gas and the other foot twitching over the brake. Eisenhower signed it with a flourish, and just like that, the clock started ticking. States got a promise. The feds would cover 90% of the bill, but only if the miles kept coming year after year. If you missed your targets, money dried up and the work stopped cold. The official story called it the National Interstate and Defense Highway System because every mile of blacktop was supposed to move tanks as easily as Buicks. But for the men on the ground, that defense talk was just another way to say, hurry up. Every contract came stamped with deadlines, cost ceilings, and a warning. Delays meant more than angry politicians. They meant layoffs, busted budgets, and half-finished cuts through the Rockies left to rot in the snow. The funding split sounded generous, 90 cents on the dollar, straight from Washington, but it came with strings as thick as bridge cables. Uniform design standards, 4-lane minimums, and mandatory mountain cuts, no matter how much granite stood in the way. Field bosses started reading the law like it was a bomb manual. Every day lost to drill and blast meant a day closer to penalty clauses and angry phone calls from the Bureau of Public Roads. And when the first crews hit solid stone, the old tricks, dynamite, jackhammers, prayer, could not keep pace with the schedule. That's when the real frustration started. The mountain didn't care about deadlines, but the men with clipboards sure did. The pressure wasn't just in the hydraulic lines, it was in every paycheck, every sunrise, every mile that wasn't finished yet. Every man on those mountain crews learned to hate the sound of the foreman's whistle. You'd drag yourself out of a canvas tent, boots still wet from yesterday, and the first thing you'd see was a wall of rock daring you to make a dent. The Rockies only gave you June to September, maybe 100 frost-free days if you were lucky. The rest of the year, the snow buried the job site and the schedule along with it. That meant every hour lost to busted drills, bad dynamite, or a stubborn seam of granite was a shot straight to the paycheck. Blasting was supposed to be the answer, but it was misery in a powder box. You'd spend half the morning drilling holes with air hammers that shook your bones, then haul 50-pound crates of dynamite up a goat path. Every charge had to be wired and tamped by hand, sweat running down your back while you tried not to think about the last guy who lost a finger to a misfire. Department of Transportation reports stacked up with tales of delays, waiting for the powder man, waiting for the smoke to clear, waiting for the all clear after some stray fuse fizzled out. Half the time, a blast would just rattle the mountain and leave the rock laughing, still solid, still in the way. Every delay bled money. Crews sat idle while the foreman argued with inspectors about fly rock and noise complaints from the next county over. The paperwork for every lost day grew heavier than the stone itself. Fuel bills climbed, overtime stacked up, and the Bureau of Public Roads started sniffing around for someone to blame. If you missed your window, winter shut the whole job down and you started over next year. If you were lucky enough to get rehired, it wasn't just slow, it was dangerous. The mountain didn't care if you had a deadline. It didn't care if a charge went off early or a boulder came down where a man was standing. Every time you heard that muffled thump, you flinched, not just from the blast, but from the thought of picking up the pieces afterward. The only thing worse than the noise was the silence that followed, when you waited to see what the mountain would give up and what it would keep. Everyone out there wanted something better, something that could bite into stone without blowing up half the hillside or half the crew. You want to know what violence looks like in steel? Start with a single tooth, one forged shank, thicker than your thigh, bolted to 70,000 pounds of angry yellow tractor. The boys in Peoria didn't waste time with fancy shapes or clever tricks. They built a claw, 1 point, no mercy. All that weight, all that torque, funneled down to a tip smaller than a coffee cup. That's not an exaggeration. Picture a fully loaded semi, 35 tons, balanced on a dynamug. Now imagine pressing that into solid limestone until the stone gives up before the steel does. That's the kind of pressure we're talking about. Geometry wasn't an accident. They angled the shank just right, 45 degrees, so when the operator dropped it into the cut, it didn't just scrape the surface. It bit in, found the rock's weak spot, and pried it open like a crowbar on a frozen padlock. The tungsten carbide tip was pure overkill, harder than the steel behind it, tough enough to spark when it struck quartz. You would see a flash, hear the shriek, and feel the whole rig shudder as the mountain tried to push back. But the D9 just kept pushing. Hydraulics did the heavy lifting. Twin cylinders, each one thick as your arm, fed by a pump that could spit out 300 gallons a minute at 150 pounds per square inch. That's enough pressure to split a railroad rail if you aimed it wrong. Every time you pulled the lever, you could feel it in your bones, metal groaning, oil hissing, frame creaking as the shank punched through another seam. The whole machine flexed, tracks clawing for grip, engine dropping into a low, angry growl. It wasn't subtle, the rock never stood a chance. But neither did any part of the machine that wasn't built to take punishment. That's why the shank was one solid piece, no welds, no seams, just a single bar of steel, heat-treated until it rang like a bell when you hit it. Anything less, and the mountain would snap it off like a toothpick. You learn to respect that kind of violence. You learn to listen for the sound of steel winning, or the warning groan that meant it was about to lose. Steel doesn't care about paperwork, but paperwork decides if steel gets made. Back in the shop, nothing left the floor unless Margaret Stark signed her name to it. She wasn't just a patent specialist, she was the firewall between a good idea and a lawsuit, and she knew the value of a single bolt. On October 23, 1956, her filing hit the patent office, a hydraulic rock-ripping attachment for bulldozers. It read like a recipe for violence, one shank forged as thick as your forearm, bolted to a tractor frame that could take a punch and keep chewing. But the real secret wasn't in the paperwork. It lived in the heat treat oven, where the difference between hero and scrap metal came down to a few degrees. Early shanks cracked like breadsticks under the first hard hit. That's what happens when you trust plain carbon steel AISI 1045 against the Rockies. The answer was 4340 alloy, the kind of steel you find in aircraft gear and tank axles. Nickel, chromium, molybdenum, each element added for a reason, every atom there to keep the shank from shattering when the mountain pushed back. Preheat to 1500 degrees, hammer it into shape, then oil quench and temper until it rang like a railroad spike. If you missed the mark, the mountain would find your mistake and break it for you. The mechanics called it witchcraft, but it was just metallurgy done right. After the switch, breakage rates dropped. You could trust the shank to bite, not snap. The tungsten carbide tip was brazed on last, a glinting promise that the rock would give up first. Meanwhile, the hydraulic circuit got its own overhaul, pressure relief valves, new seals, a venting system to keep the oil from boiling when the shank hit something that refused to move. You could feel the difference in the lever. No more spongy play, just solid force all the way down. Every improvement came with a test, sometimes in the lab, sometimes under a mountain. When the paperwork lined up with the steel, and the steel lined up with the operator's instincts, you had a machine ready for war. That's when the field bosses stopped grumbling and started asking for more claws, more power, more ways to make the mountain bleed. Shale was the warm-up act, the kind of rock that lets you believe in miracles, at least for a morning. The first time you drop the ripper tooth into a layer of shale, there is a sound you learn to love. Not a shriek, not a bang, but a deep, gravelly groan as the shank finds the seam and starts to pry. The D9's engine settles into a low, steady rumble, tracks clawing forward, and the whole machine feels like it is finally doing what it was born for. Shale gives up easy, splitting in slabs with a satisfying pop as the pressure builds, then lets go all at once. You get these long, clean rips, like tearing cardboard, if the cardboard weighed a ton and fought back. The operators know by ear when they are winning. You listen for the pitch to drop, for the vibration in the cab to hit that sweet spot where the rock is breaking, not just pushing back. Some guys swear you can feel it in your EAR, the way the harmonics travel up through the frame and into your bones. They will ride the lever with one hand, feathering the hydraulics, nudging the shank just so. If you are good, you can walk the line between too much bite and not enough, keeping the tooth buried but never stuck. On shale, you start to feel cocky. The schedule catches up, the foreman grins, and the men on the ground think maybe, just maybe, this monster really can make the mountain move. But every mechanic knows shale is just the appetizer. The real test comes when the stone turns white and dense, when the easy breaks are gone, and the ripper's roar gets swallowed by something older and meaner. That is when you find out if all this steel has any guts. Limestone doesn't give up easy. You drop the shank, and it does not split like shale. It groans, it fights, it makes you earn every yard. That is where the ripper claw proved it was not just a gimmick. Out on the job, you would watch the numbers pile up. 5 times the rock moved, 5 times the progress, all in the same shift. Operators logged 4.1 cubic yards per hour through stone that used to stall a crew for days. The old-timers shook their heads, muttering about dynamite, but the numbers did not lie. Drill and blast crawled at less than 1 yard per hour. The ripper clawed out 5, steady as a freight train. Fuel burned hotter, 7 gallons an hour, easy, but nobody cared so long as the mountain moved. You could smell the diesel, feel the heat rolling off the block, watch the exhaust stack pulse with every bite. The trick was to hunt for fault lines, the invisible cracks the mountain tried to hide. Get it right, and the shank would pry open a seam like a crowbar under a coffin lid. Get it wrong, and you would feel the whole rig shudder, the engine bog down, the cab rattle so hard your teeth ached. But when it worked, it was beautiful. Steel and oil against limestone, and limestone always lost. Project engineers started carrying stopwatches and notebooks, tracking every pass. One of them, a sharp kid from Denver, scribbled in the margin, "Productivity up 5 times. No delays, no powder." That is what the claw bought you. Time, progress, and a fighting chance against the rock. Limestone doesn't just break, it surrenders, but only after a fight you feel in your teeth. Drop the claw, throttle up, and the D9's engine bellows so loud it drowns out your own heartbeat. The shank bites into a seam, pressure climbing, frame flexing, tracks clawing for grip. For a second, nothing moves. Then, crack. The sound isn't a pop or a bang. It's a deep, wet snap, like a tree splitting in a thunderstorm, only heavier. The whole mountain seems to shudder. Slabs the size of bathtubs peel away from the face, tumbling down in slow motion, thudding against the ground hard enough to rattle your boots. Diesel smoke rolls out, thick and blue, as the engine digs in and the hydraulics groan with the strain. You can taste metal in the air, feel the vibration in your bones. That's the moment every operator waits for, the instant when all that steel and oil and fire finally wins. The mountain gives way, and the Ripper's tooth slides through, leaving a raw scar of broken stone. For a few seconds, you feel invincible. The schedule catches up, the foreman's scowl melts into a grin, and the men on the ground stand a little taller. But everyone knows what's coming next. Limestone cracks, granite bites back. Granite doesn't break, it fights back. The first time you drop the claw into a boulder that will not budge, you learn what shock load really means. I remember Wyoming, 1959. An operator named Hall, tough as nails. He was crawling up a basalt outcrop, slow and steady, the shank biting in, the engine grumbling. Suddenly, the whole rig snapped back like a bear trap. The shank rebounded so hard it slammed the cab and threw Hall against the steel. His femur snapped clean. Bone versus 70,000 pounds of steel, and bone always loses. OSHA showed up later, scribbling on their pads, but all you could see was blood on the seat and a Ripper tooth still stuck in stone. Their report, 59 Turbo WY12, blamed loose bolts on the mounting flange. It did not matter to Hall. He spent the rest of the season in traction. The year after, in Colorado, the main hydraulic cylinder blew at the weld, splitting like a sausage skin. Oil sprayed everywhere. The cab shuddered, the frame groaned. The weld had not been heat-treated right, left soft and brittle, just waiting for the mountain to call its bluff. When that pressure came back through the lines, it did not care about paperwork or promises. Metal cracked, rods bent, and the whole machine groaned like it was alive. That's the price for picking a fight with granite. The operator was still inside, hands white-knuckled on the levers, praying the next hit would not come through the floor. You can reinforce steel, torque every bolt, but you cannot outsmart physics. The mountain always gets a say. December of 1961, Washington State. One of ours tips over sideways after a rebound. The frame is twisted, and the operator walks away with bruises and a story he will tell for the rest of his life. They sent the machine back to the shop on a flatbed, and the rest of us circled the wreck like crows picking over a carcass. That is when you really learn what the mountain can do to steel. The weld near the rear axle had split wide open, like a zipper torn by a giant's hand. You could see where the shock traveled, bolt holes stretched oval, paint scorched where the hydraulic lines let go. The autopsy was ugly, but honest. No hiding what failed, no blaming the rock. The logs that winter filled up with shop notes, reinforce the frame, add a 1/4 inch of steel at the root, torque every bolt tighter than you think is sane. Caterpillar sent out a bulletin, spring-loaded recoil damper, new spec for the mounting flange, mandatory ultrasonic checks on every weld. Operators started bolting surplus Army seatbelts straight to the cab floor. You did not wait for the company to tell you twice. That is how it went, one disaster at a time. The men and the machines learning together, every scar in the steel a lesson written in blood and diesel. You want to talk about progress? It is not in the glossy brochures, it is in the bruises, the busted knuckles, and the way every mechanic leaves a little smarter than he started. Steel still wins most days, but the mountain never really surrenders. Every mile of highway you drive was paid for in shattered bolts, torn knuckles, and the gamble of a man sitting inches from 70,000 pounds of fury. Today's machines are smarter and quieter, but the rock is just as stubborn. Progress always comes at this price: force against resistance, flesh against fate. Thanks for riding shotgun through the fight.